Gardevoir is said to have the power to create black holes, yet it's not the only Pokemon with an ability that would seemingly destroy the world. But if that's true, then how does the Pokemon world still exist? Well, that's what we'll be discussing today. So without further delay, let's get started. According to multiple different dex entries, Gardevoir has to expend all of its psychic energy in order to create a black hole, something it's said to do in order to protect its trainer. But wouldn't a black hole destroy its surroundings and ultimately harm Gardevoir's trainer? Because anything near a black hole would essentially cross a boundary known as the event horizon, a point where, as far as interaction is concerned, it's effectively removed from the universe. And it's not like Gardevoir could simply aim the black hole at its opponent either, because black holes only function when gravity is completely winning against everything else, in this case including its trainer. But why does Gardevoir create a black hole then? Well, I think a part of the reason has to do with the fact that Gardevoir's black holes are specifically stated to be small. Which is important because small black holes have a far less of an effect than larger ones, and more importantly are only able to exist for a fraction of a second. Now, that doesn't mean that these black holes are any less dangerous than their counterparts. It's just that they wouldn't instantly end the world. And I say instantly because a little thing called Hawking radiation still makes these black holes very powerful. Essentially, when a black hole dissipates, it does so because it's no longer able to sustain itself. But when it does, that evaporation releases energy as radiation, energy that, interestingly enough, becomes more powerful the smaller the black hole is. So, knowing all that, how does the world still exist as we know it? Well, I think Gardevoir doesn't just create black holes, but can also control them. That would make sense, seeing how in another one of Gardevoir's dex entries, it's apparently not able to feel the effect of gravity thanks to control over its psychic power. This makes me think that when Gardevoir is set to use all of its psychic energy to create a small black hole, rather than it all being used at once, Gardevoir uses it over a span of time in order to continue feeding the black hole so that it can dissipate under Gardevoir's control. To a point where even after it has no more psychic power left to give, it continues to control it and therefore risks its life in the process. A Pokemon I've actually been meaning to address for quite some time now is Lanturn, because according to its Pokedex entries, it emits a light so bright that it can illuminate the ocean surface from a depth of over 3 miles. To put that into perspective, 3 miles is about the size of not 1, not 2, but 80 football fields. Now, if you compare that to the sun, 3 miles is nothing. But here the difference is that space acts almost like a perfect vacuum, meaning hardly any light gets absorbed along the way. The ocean, on the other hand, absorbs much more light thanks to its dense water. Basically, this would mean that for something to emit light that illuminates a distance of over 3 miles, it would have to release so much energy that the water around it would essentially begin to boil. But clearly we don't ever see this happening. So why is that? Well, I think the answer lies in what kind of light Lanturn is actually producing. Because knowing that Lanturn is actually based on, well, an anglerfish, it also makes sense for it to emit a similar blue-green wavelength of light, which compared to other wavelengths penetrates water far better. But even then, blue-green light would still struggle to travel 3 miles continuously, which is why I think Lanturn doesn't use a steady beam of light, but instead flashes it in very precise momentary bursts. And that actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because a burst of light packs all of its energy in a single instant, rather than spreading it out over time. Meaning that unlike a steady beam of light, it could reach the surface almost immediately, giving water barely any time to absorb the heat and begin to boil. And while yes, this isn't something we see happen normally in nature, given that the total energy involved here is still far less than a continuous light would require, this seems far more reasonable than anything else. Meaning that instead of the Pokedex implying Lanturn's light is illuminating the entire ocean surface, maybe it actually refers to a small visible pinpoint of light. Another Pokemon whose Pokedex entries raises some serious questions is Machamp. Like, apparently it can move entire mountains with a single arm and even throw people or Pokemon far over the horizon. The issue here isn't really how far Machamp can throw something, but rather how much force that would actually require, because launching anything over the horizon means accelerating it to an absurd speed in a very short amount of time. And that amount of force wouldn't just affect whatever Machamp is throwing, it would also affect the ground beneath it. Essentially, the shockwaves released on impact would probably alone be enough to destroy terrain and even collapse entire structures. Yet despite all of that, we don't really see this happening. I mean, Machamp are shown living near people and even helping them in day-to-day life without harming them. To me, that makes it pretty clear that Machamp's strength isn't something that's constantly being unleashed at full force. And I think a large reason why this has to do with Machamp's pre-evolution Machoke, because according to one of its Pokedex entries, Machoke wears a power restraining belt specifically to keep its strength under control. Considering that we clearly still see this belt on Machoke even after it has evolved into Machamp, I'd imagine this belt would likely still serve a similar purpose. And this does make sense, seeing how in another one of Machoke's dex entries, it's clearly stated that without this belt, it wouldn't even be able to regulate its own motions. Thus, with that in mind, I believe that what the so-called world-ending Pokedex entries are actually describing is a scenario where Machamp isn't restrained and therefore able to unleash its full power. Though then again, it's apparently also stated that no one has ever removed this belt. Sadly, I don't have an exact answer as to how Pokemon professors would have known about Machamp's true strength if it hasn't yet been removed, so at most I'd imagine these are just speculations. But if you have a better idea, then I'd love to hear your opinions down in the comments. And if you'd like to join us in helping answer more game logic that as of now just doesn't really make any sense whatsoever, then consider subscribing and leaving a like. Another Pokemon I think is important to address is Tyranitar, because according to its Pokedex entries, it's able to destroy entire mountains, to the point that maps need to be redrawn afterwards. So why hasn't the world been turned into a flattened wasteland? Well, I think a lot of this comes down to when Tyranitar actually ends up changing the landscape. I mean, looking at where we're able to find Tyranitar in the games, we'll notice that in the few regions it does appear in, it's almost always found in mountainous areas. The example in Galar is especially important here, because according to Duraludon's description on the official Sword and Shield website, it specifically fights Tyranitar in the mountains because they live in these shared regions. For me, that makes one thing abundantly clear. Not everywhere Tyranitar goes, a mountain ends up being flattened. Now, that being said, I still think the Pokedex entry holds some truth to it. Because if we look at it again, we're told that Tyranitar only destroys the surrounding terrain when it rampages. And while yes, we don't know exactly what triggers Tyranitar's rampages, the only other time it deliberately destroys a mountain is when it builds its nest. This makes these rampages sound like they happen for a very specific reason. Which brings us to why I don't think Tyranitar affects the world like we think it does. Because what if during its constant search for stronger opponents, Tyranitar eventually ends up severely injured and therefore enters a rampage? But instead of that rampage meaning it blindly tears the world apart, it may actually push Tyranitar to ensure its lineage continues. After all, according to its first stage evolution, Larvitar needs to eat an entire mountain's worth of dirt in order to evolve. So by destroying a mountain to build a nest, Tyranitar may be using the last of its strength to feed a growing Larvitar, one that will eventually continue to live in its place. Thus, considering that these rampages would therefore likely only occur on very rare occasions, I'd imagine landscapes changed by Tyranitar don't occur as often as we originally thought they would. This next Pokemon is in my opinion one of the most concerning. Because according to one of Maccargo's Pokedex entries, its internal body temperature can exceed 18,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which quite literally makes it hotter than the surface of the sun. Meaning that if this heat were being freely released into its surroundings, simply standing near a Maccargo should result in instant vaporization. Yet, despite all of that, we repeatedly see Maccargo existing in the world without causing constant destruction. And that at most, raindrops falling around it are instantly turned into steam. But you know, that detail actually tells us something important. It tells us that Maccargo's heat clearly isn't being transferred outward as efficiently as the raw number would suggest. And I think a lot of this has to do with how quickly heat is able to move from one object to another. Because, for example, a lightning bolt can reach temperatures of around 50,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet, because it doesn't remain in contact with its surroundings for very long, it doesn't instantly melt everything it passes through. Now, if we were to apply this to Maccargo, you would think that in this case the heat does remain in contact. But that is until we consider that the speed at which heat transfer occurs also depends heavily on the materials involved. I mean, take a frying pan on a stove. Because the handle is made of a different material than the pan itself, it takes much longer for heat to travel all the way to the handle. Which leads me to believe that Maccargo functions almost like an extremely well insulated container that keeps most of its thermal energy within itself. Of course, there's still the problem of this picture's existence, so I'm just going to assume that this girl either isn't human or Maccargo's body temperature is releasing heat very, very slowly. Since this channel is all about unexplained game logic, not just Pokemon, be sure to let me know in the comments which other games you think I should cover. Thanks for watching.